Good afternoon, it's Gary Sly in the Legacy of Handmade Objects. I'm in the shop today during a work day, so if you see a little pause, it means I've had to jump up and respond to some customers or something like that. But I'm going to be out tromping around on my regular Monday day off, so I figured I better get some content up and ready for this week today. It's a busy time here. It's that time of the year when many of your shops are participating in an online needlework exchange. Back during COVID, this program started because we couldn't gather in person. It's another one of the places where shops buy designs and other things from wholesale designers and creators. I still prefer going to Nashville and putting my hands on everything, but the online version does give me an opportunity to look at some of the new designs, and so there'll be some nice new stuff here in the shop soon. Some other news I want to share, but not give a lot of details about today, is that the shop is moving. As I move into 2025, I'll be in a new location. Got a great big old Victorian mansion down the street that I'm going to be moving into, and I'll give you many more details about that as we get closer to the time. I'm pretty excited about it. What I want to do today is just share a little bit of what I've got going on here in the shop. I've got some stitching that I'm working on, some crewel embroidery, so I'll just talk about that briefly. And then I want to finish up our discussion of samplers that I started last week. At that point, I looked at samplers in Europe, and I want to cross over the ocean today and talk a little bit about what I can say about samplers as they progressed in the United States. Just kind of show off a little bit a piece that I'm working on. This is a crewel embroidery kit, and you can see I finished a little froggy and some of the lily pad that goes with him. This design is actually huge, and I've showed it before. It's a piece that I'm finishing for somebody else. It's a kit that was created back in the 1970s. You can see it's pretty large, and unfortunately the fabric has a lot of age spots on it, but we've decided that just gives it its special character. If you've never done crewel embroidery, it's a great technique for starting stitchers to do, because all you have to do is trace a design on a piece of fabric and cover it with yarn. You can make up your own stitches. You can get a collection somewhere online or in printed sources of all the different stitches. One of the nice things about these old kits is that they give you an insert and they show you all the different embroidery stitches, many of which most of us have never even used. I don't think I've ever used turkey work stitch before, but others are quite familiar, and so you can always find things like that. And embroidery is a really good way for beginners or folks who kind of like to design on their own to go out there and do some work. Thread painting was popular at one point in the past, and in a lot of ways you see it coming back as one of the skills that people are working on today. So I'm working on that crewel piece. I did a lot of crewel before I discovered cross stitch, and so it's always kind of fun to reach back and do something like that. So as I mentioned in last week's episode, the emergence of samplers in the New World came over from various European travelers and settlers who eventually came to what was then the colonies, and which has since become the United States. From what I've been able to tell in my research, there are only 12 samplers that still exist that come to us from the 1600s. The first one, a sampler made by a woman named Anne Gower, was actually begun in England in 1610. But she brought it over to the Massachusetts colony as she traveled with her husband, John Endicott, who became the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So very early in the history of the Massachusetts section of the world, samplers were starting. Laura Standish who was at the Plymouth colony in 1645, also created a sampler which is in existence. I don't have picture examples of those samplers, and I'm sure there's some folks who've done some wonderful work in terms of kind of figuring out what those samplers represent, and pictures and all that. So that would be a fun little path if you want to go down and do some research. While I'm talking about it, there is a tapestry being done at Plymouth, at the museum there near Plymouth Rock, that tells the history of the Massachusetts colony. If you ever want to know more about that, go on to Facebook and look up the Plymouth Tapestry. It's a fascinating process that they're working on right now, and it's happening as we speak. Some other things to know about the early samplers, or the development of samplers in the United States, and I mentioned this briefly last time. Schools or academies that were set up in the U.S. for well-to-do women, and it would have been those who could afford some sort of formal training or education, began to be established early in the 1700s, mostly in New England, but there's some evidence that there were some throughout the colonies. Those existed up into the early 1800s, when you see different trends in education beginning to be established. And one of the things that was pretty important in those women's academies was learning how to stitch. And that builds on some of the discussion that I had in my first episode about samplers. But those who have studied samplers that still exist in the United States are able to look at those samplers and know a little bit about who taught various women to do samplers, because they were done in group settings a lot of time in schools. Another interesting thing to look at if you begin to explore individual samplers, and that's a fun thing to do if you have the chance, if you own some in your own family, or if there's some that you find in a museum or somewhere near you that you can look at. The alphabets were going through some transition in that period when the United States is being established and the early colonies become states. Many early samplers do not have a J or a U, because at that point the script was built off the Latin alphabet, and those letters did not function separately in the Latin alphabet the way they do in the script that we use today. You can look that up if you're interested. There's a family sampler that I've had a lot of time to study. I don't have it anymore, but a wonderful family sampler from New England. And one of the interesting things about that, when you look at it closely, is in the lowercase area of that sampler, you see an S, but then you see something that looks like a little F next to it. Those indicate a particular period of time when they were moving to a more modern typeset as part of kind of the process of printing, and the lowercase s in some early samplers looks like a lowercase f, because that's the way it would have been typescripted or typeset early as printing was beginning to be established. Probably a little more detail than I need to go into, but what that leads me to talk about just briefly is how much information you can find out about a stitcher just by looking at a sampler. We know that a lot of times women might have done an early sampler when they were very young, but then they might have done other samplers later, even as adults, and in some cases as older women. One of the books that I've had a fascinating time studying lately is this one called A Stitch in Time. The subtitle of this one is The Needlework of Aging Women in Antebellum America. So, of course, before the Civil War. This book covers both samplers and quilts made by older women, and I've talked about this book before, so it's a repeat from that standpoint, but it's got some great information about some of the samplers that were made by women. One of the funny stories from it is that sometimes older women did not want their age to be known. And so if they had a sampler that they had done at an earlier age and they had put the date of it on there and their age, sometimes they would take those stitches out so that nobody would be able to tell their age. Again, samplers are almost like a fingerprint or a photo, in that there's so much we can learn about the individual who stitched them, sometimes even if we don't know their name or their identity or anything. Leads me to mention just a wonderful little book that my friend Sally and Susan Greening Davis did called A Journey with Sybil. They bought an antique sampler in Europe that was done by a little girl in Belgium, I believe, and they were able to write an entire book talking about the themes and the ideas that Sybil used in her sampler. Now, hers was not a sampler with an traditional alphabet and numbers, but it was a spot sampler, and I mentioned this briefly in the first episode about samplers. Another really interesting little side trip that I took was reading a book called Stitching the World, Embroidered Maps and Women's Geographical Education. Now, I emphasized earlier that samplers would have been something that girls would have used to learn the alphabet and the numbers. But in some areas, particularly in the United States, at one school in the U.S., girls stitched geographical samplers. They stitched maps. They stitched samplers that would show, the states in the Union, or they might look at the particular county they lived in and stitch in landmarks and cities and things like that. So again, this might have been a part of the process of educating young girls, and it would give them a chance to study geography as they were stitching. I know I have a wonderful, or I finished a wonderful piece some years back that ended up being passed on to a friend of my son's, where we looked at the map of the eastern shore of North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. So there's still times when you'll see us stitching maps and stitching outlines of areas, and some of the history goes back to that early period. Well, I'm lucky enough to have a couple wonderful old samplers here in the shop, and it's always fun for me to look at them, to explore a little bit about the history of them here. Now, the first one I have is a vintage sampler that was made in 1805, and I'll see if I can just kind of hold it up. I know there's glare and all that, and you probably can't see it very well, but it is here in the shop and it is for sale. It was stitched in 1805. About all we know about the identity of the person is to know that it's stitched in English. It does not have a traditional alphabet and the numbers on it, and it does have some spot motifs and then some poetry, some flowery language there on it. It was stitched by somebody named G. Davies, and we know that it was done in 1805. One of the things I would encourage you to do if you ever have samplers framed and somebody is taking that sampler apart in order to put it into something acid-free and safe, is you have them take a picture of the back of the sampler. Sally, my friend, when she frames antique samplers, always does this, and she laminates it and keeps it with the original piece. Now, when I look at the back of a sampler, guess what? I can learn some things about the stitcher then. Look at how messy this back area is here with all the threads that are drawn over. Somebody there was not taking their time in finishing up that bottom part. Some of the rest of it doesn't look too bad. They did pull some stitches over and connect. But what you want to be sure of when you're stitching is that those drawn threads in the back don't show up in the front. And unfortunately, when I look at that sampler up close, I can see those threads shining through the fabric. So that's a wonderful way of kind of figuring out what's happening. So we can assume that G. Davies was a little girl and that this sampler was stitched in 1805, which is a pretty early version of samplers in a lot of ways. Now this is an interesting piece. Somebody just brought this into me in the shop. It was rolled up nicely, and they said, here, you can have it. I don't know what to do with it. So it's a red work sampler for the most part. There's a little bit of color here in some of the motif work. It is a traditional band sampler with an alphabet and the numbers and a fancy script alphabet. But what's unique about this one, if you look at the bottom, is it has the Greek alphabet. So beginning with alpha and going to omega, it has the Greek alphabet, and it does have the year 1900 stitched in it. There's no initials and there's no name associated with it, so we don't know any more about it than that. But again, sometimes we stitchers like to look at the back. I haven't framed this one yet. I'm getting ready to do something with it. But you can see the back is a little messy. So again, that might indicate a younger stitcher who didn't want to take the trouble to bother with all those little loose ends, or maybe a teacher who wasn't following them too closely and didn't instruct them to clean that up. I say all the time that I don't worry about what backs look like unless it affects how it looks from the front. This is a commercial fabric that this is stitched on. Certainly by the 1900s it would have been. And it's got a little bit of an age stain to it, but it's not too bad. So it's a fascinating piece, and even though we probably will never know who actually stitched it, we already know a little bit about them. I don't even know how to speculate about why the Greek alphabet is there. It could be that the family had Greek origins and that they were reflecting their heritage there. The other thing, it could be reflecting Christianity and the connection between the Greek alphabet and the Greek New Testament, because certainly the phrase alpha and omega, the beginning and the end of the Greek alphabet, are very important as we think about kind of Christian iconography. A lot of time in the churches, you'll see representation of the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end. So that's a fun piece. I'm going to do a little bit more work doing some hem stitch around the edges to make sure it doesn't unravel anymore. And then I'm going to frame it and have it here in the shop. So that's where I'm going to stop with samplers now. I've got tons and tons of samplers here. Sometimes I'd like to explore some of the fancy stitches that are really popular in samplers. I love the eyelet stitch, for instance, and if I can figure out how to film it, we'll work on an eyelet stitch one day and let you see kind of what that looks like. But aside from that, I hope you have a great week. This is Gary Sly. As always, it's the legacy of handmade objects.